For 6 years, he stood behind the same metal bars while every other dog found a home. People walked past him. Volunteers even cried for him, but no one ever took him home. Until one day, someone did something no one could have imagined, and what happened next will touch your heart in a way you never expected. At the shelter, his name was Thor. He had arrived as a young German shepherd, strong, alert, and full of life. Now, at 8 years old, he was still waiting. Every morning, the shelter staff would open the kennels to clean and feed the dogs. And every morning, Thor would rise, walk to the front, and sit with his ears pricked, hoping that someone might stop, look past the sadness in his eyes, and see the dog that remained behind the cold bars, even if they never had before. The volunteers adored him for his calm, gentle nature. He never barked as people passed by and would let children pet him through the bars without flinching. Even when other dogs barked or snarled around him, he remained patient. He never pushed forward or begged for attention. But week after week, year after year, he was overlooked, deemed too big, too old, too serious. The labels stuck, and so did he. One of the newer volunteers, a 27-year-old woman named Camilla, had been at the shelter for about 2 months when she first truly noticed him. Unlike the other dogs, he didn't jump, pace, or bark. He simply sat tall, his calm eyes observing everything around him. There was something melancholic in his gaze, not because he seemed broken, but because he looked as if he'd given up hope that anyone would ever choose him. One afternoon, Camilla asked the shelter coordinator, Letitia, "Why is he still here?" Letitia sighed. "Thor has an old soul. He came to us after his owner died in a fire. No microchip, no family. He's healthy and sweet, but nobody wants the dog who's been waiting the longest." Camilla looked back at the kennel. There he was, quiet, dignified, and alone. That night, Camilla couldn't sleep. She kept picturing those eyes, not desperate, just tired. She picked up her phone and posted on social media. "This is Thor. He's been in a shelter for 6 years and has never had a single adoption trial. Please share his story." After hitting post, she went to sleep without much expectation. By morning, the post had been shared by over 2,000 people. By noon, more than 20,000. And by nightfall, national news outlets were calling to cover the story. But what no one expected was who would see that post next, and what they would say when they called the shelter. It wasn't just an emotional reaction. It was something that would change everything for Thor. The next day, the shelter was buzzing with activity. Phones rang off the hook, emails poured in, and volunteers whispered as they passed Thor's kennel, some with smiles, others with tears in their eyes. They tried to hide their excitement as the post went viral, hitting over 50,000 shares in less than 24 hours. Offers of help came from as far away as Rio Grande do Sul, Paraná, and even from overseas. But the biggest surprise came in one particular message. Camilla was in the office with Letitia, holding her phone with both hands. Her voice trembling slightly, she read, "I think that's the dog I lost. His name was Thor. I've been looking for him for years. Please tell me it's really him." Letitia narrowed her eyes. "Do you think it's real?" Camilla turned the phone so Letitia could see the attached photos. They showed images from 8 years ago, before the fire. A younger version of Thor, running in the snow, lying on a living room rug next to a man with a kind-eyed, bearded face. The same ears, the same small white patch under his chin, and that same steady gaze. "It's him," Letitia whispered. Camilla swallowed hard. What do we do? We have to get him here. 2 days later, the shelter parking lot was quiet until a silver SUV pulled in. A weathered man, likely in his late 30s, stepped out wearing jeans and a plaid shirt, his eyes fixed on the entrance. This was Marcos, and he had been searching for his dog Thor ever since the fire that destroyed his cabin. He had spent months in the hospital, and by the time he recovered, no one knew where Thor had gone. The shelter that first took him in had closed years ago, its records lost to time. Marcos had assumed Thor was gone forever, until he saw the photo in Camilla's post, and his heart broke open with hope. Letitia met him at the door and led him down the back hallway to Thor's kennel. There, on a soft blanket, the old German shepherd lay with his head resting on his front paws. At the sound of footsteps, he slowly lifted his head and froze. No one moved. Camilla watched in silence as Marcos knelt just outside the bars and whispered, "Thor." The dog blinked and tilted his head. Hearing his name, something flickered to life inside him, something that had been dormant for years. Then, without a bark or a hesitation, he stood, walked to the gate, and sat, just as he always did. But this time he wasn't facing a stranger. He was looking into the eyes of the man who had never stopped waiting for him. Marcos reached a trembling hand through the bars and gently touched the side of Thor's face. The dog didn't move. Slowly, a soft, trembling whine escaped him. His tail thumped against the floor. Once, twice, then faster. Letitia turned away, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, while Camilla stood frozen, her hands over her mouth. Marcos's voice broke as he said, "I thought I'd lost you." Thor pressed his muzzle against Marcos's chest, as if to confirm that even after 6 years, the feeling of home was still there. That afternoon, the adoption papers were signed without any questions or waiting periods. Everyone at the shelter gathered to say goodbye. Staff, volunteers, and even other adopters who had followed the story online and came just to see him leave. Thor, now truly Thor again, walked proudly beside Marcos toward the door, his tail wagging. As he reached the exit, he paused, looked back down the long hallway he had known for 6 years, and then stepped out into the sunlight, into freedom, into everything he thought he had lost. But neither Marcos nor anyone else imagined that Thor's journey was far from over. Once home, he would do something that would leave Marcos, Camilla, and everyone following his story in complete awe. The first few days at home were quiet. Marcos lived in a small, cozy rented house on the outskirts of Belo Horizonte. There were no luxuries, just a fireplace, a sofa, and a few framed photos of a life that had once been full but had been shattered. Now that life was beginning to rebuild itself with the sound of paws on the wooden floor, the gentle clink of a water bowl, and the soft sigh of a contented sleep. Thor quickly claimed the living room rug as his own, as if it had always belonged to him. Marcos couldn't stop watching him, not obsessively, but with a sense of wonder. He watched how Thor moved, how he scanned his surroundings before settling down, and how he followed him with silent steps, as if making sure this wasn't all just a dream. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Marcos would wake to find Thor curled up beside his bed, eyes half open, breathing steadily, like a guardian watching over something precious. One morning, after a walk by a stream, Marcos decided to visit the site of his old cabin for the first time since the fire. Thor sat in the back seat, alert but calm. The closer they got, the more Marcos noticed a change in him. Thor's ears perked up, his eyes narrowed with focus. The memories were heavy. When they arrived, the ruins were barely visible, just charred planks and moss covering what was left of the past. The place was quiet, peaceful. Marcos got out of the car, and Thor followed, but the dog didn't move forward right away. He stood still, staring intently at the edge of the woods. Marcos followed his gaze and said softly, "Thor." But the dog remained motionless, fixated on something. Then, with a sense of purpose, not panic, Thor bolted. "Thor!" Marcos called, his heart pounding, and followed him down a slope, through thick brush, until they reached a narrow clearing by the stream. There, Thor stood frozen, his ears twitching. And then Marcos heard it. A cry. Pushing through the last of the undergrowth, Marcos froze. Curled at the base of a fallen tree was a child, no older than 4. Muddy shoes, a torn coat, and a face flushed with cold and fear. Thor approached slowly, lowering himself to the ground, his tail giving a soft, gentle wag. The child whimpered but reached out a small hand, and Thor let her touch him. Marcos rushed to the little girl's side, shrugging off his jacket. "Hey, sweetie," he said softly. "It's okay. You're safe now." The child didn't speak, but she clutched onto Thor's fur. Later, Marcos learned that a search party had been looking for the girl since dawn. Her name was Edwarda, and she had wandered away from her grandparents during a walk. According to the police chief, she never would have been found if not for Thor. His dog had saved her. The news of the rescue spread even faster than the adoption story. Thor, the shelter dog who had waited for 6 years, had become a hero. He wasn't trained for search and rescue, nor was he bred for it, but there was something in him. A memory, a bond, a sense that he had been given a second chance, that drove him to act. That night, Marcos sat by the fireplace and Thor curled at his feet as the wind whispered outside. He looked down at the dog and murmured, "You weren't just waiting for a family, were you?" Thor looked up, and Marcos continued, "You were waiting for the right moment." Thor didn't wag his tail or bark. He just rested his head on Marcos's lap and closed his eyes, as if to say that some souls don't just survive loss. They rise to help others find their way out of the dark. But there was still more to come. Camilla hadn't forgotten about Thor, and she was about to offer him an opportunity that would open a whole new chapter in his life. 3 weeks after Edwarda's rescue, the phone rang at Marcos's house. It was Letitia from the shelter, breathless with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Camilla is here. She wants to see Thor again." Marcos didn't hesitate. "Tell her to come whenever she wants." The next afternoon, Camilla arrived in a modest car, wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt, her eyes already welling with emotion. Before she could even knock, Marcos opened the door. They didn't need many words. Thor was already in the hallway, ears forward and head tilted, walking unhurriedly to sit right in front of her. Camilla knelt, her hands trembling, as she stroked the fur behind his ears, whispering, "Hey, buddy. I knew someone would see you. I just never imagined it would be like this." Thor leaned into her touch, closing his eyes as his tail swept gently across the floor. Marcos watched in silence, arms crossed, his heart full. They sat together for over an hour. Camilla told stories from the shelter, how she would walk past his kennel and murmur, "You're worth it. Just hang on." She explained that she had posted his picture that night, not expecting it to go viral, but because she couldn't bear the thought of him dying in that cage. Then, she said something that surprised Marcos. I want to start a project, a program. I don't have a name for it yet, but I want to help dogs like Thor, the ones nobody sees, the ones who wait for years without a second chance, and I want him to be a part of it. Marcos blinked. How? Therapy visits, talks at schools, shelter tours, a story to inspire people. Camilla hesitated. I know it's a lot to ask, but I think he was meant for more than just being saved. He was meant to show everyone that it's never too late. Marcos looked at Thor, who now rested calmly at Camilla's feet, wearing that patient expression that only comes from seeing too much of the world. After a moment, he let out a slow breath. Let's do it. The first visit was scheduled at a local middle school. Camilla and Marcos stood in the auditorium as 200 seventh graders listened to the story of a dog who waited 6 years in a shelter and then saved a life. Thor lay quietly beside Marcos's chair until the Q&A session. A boy in the front row raised his hand and asked how he knew where to find the little girl. Marcos didn't answer right away. He leaned down, petted Thor, and then said, he didn't know. He just never stopped believing that someone, somewhere, still needed him. Silence fell over the room, until one student began to clap, then another, and soon the entire auditorium was on its feet, a standing ovation for the dog who never gave up. In the months that followed, the program grew. Thor began visiting other schools and shelters. He comforted veterans in recovery centers, accompanied children at court hearings, and sat beside little ones learning to read for the very first time. He never barked or demanded attention. He would simply show up, and with his quiet calm, he delivered a powerful message. You are never too old. It is never too late. And you are always needed. There was one last visit to be made. A place Thor hadn't been to since his long wait at the shelter. The very shelter where he had spent so many years. At dawn, Marcos drove into the shelter's parking lot, the same one he had walked through so many times before, his heart pounding, wondering if the dog he had come to know would even be recognized. That day felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of something much greater. Camilla was already waiting at the door, wearing her time-faded volunteer t-shirt and old ID badge. As soon as Marcos got out of the car, Thor hopped down with agility, moving with the confidence of a dog who finally knew who he was. Not just a number in a cage, not seen as unreachable, and definitely not forgotten. He was happy to be home, but this time, it wasn't just to get comfortable. He had a mission. The shelter was just as he'd left it. Gray walls, the faint scent of bleach mixed with fur, and the kennels lined up down the hall like a tunnel of second chances waiting to be discovered. But the staff reacted differently when they saw Thor walk through the door. All down the corridor, tails began to wag from behind the gates, the tails of dogs who were still waiting. Dogs who perhaps sensed the change in the air, because Thor was proof that the burden of waiting could finally be lifted. Leticia came out of her office, holding a clipboard and a tissue, laughing through tears as she said, I knew this would get me. She knelt, and Thor went straight to her. He pressed his forehead against hers as she whispered, You did it, boy. You made everyone believe again. Camilla then led Thor and Marcos to the end of the hall. There, where his kennel once stood, was now a glass panel with a plaque that read, Thor waited 6 years. Now, no dog will wait alone again. Inside the display were photos of Thor through the years, behind the bars, in the media, with Eduarda at the schools, with Marcos, and even an image of his old ID tag marked Kennel 12. Camilla pulled a new, small tag from her bag. It read, Ambassador Thor, Giver of Hope. Marcos carefully attached it to Thor's collar. The dog wagged his tail once, then sat beside the display, calm and serene as always. Now, the people who walked by didn't ignore him. They stopped to read his story. Children knelt to wave at him, and new adopters asked if they could meet the dog who had waited so long. Thor didn't mind. He let them come close, let them pet him, let them shed their tears, because he knew this place was no longer a prison, but a new beginning. And he was the living proof. Later that day, Thor surprised everyone again. While Camilla was giving a short speech to the staff and visitors, Thor stood up, walked away from Marcos, and went to one of the nearby kennels. Inside, a shy, frightened pit bull mix named Bento was waiting, a dog who had already been returned twice. Thor sat down outside Bento's kennel, not barking or moving, just waiting. Within minutes, Bento moved closer and gently placed his paw on the gate, exactly as Thor had once done for Camilla. The shelter coordinator wiped away another tear and murmured, I think he just chose the next one. As the sun set, Thor was back in the car, his head resting on the console between the seats. Marcos leaned over and whispered, Ready to go? Thor closed his eyes and gave a single wag of his tail, as if to say yes. That night, Camilla posted a photo of Thor in front of his display with the caption, He came back to show everyone it's possible. Thor doesn't live in a kennel anymore. He lives in our hearts. The post reached over 1 million people in less than 2 days. Donations poured in, adoptions surged, and thanks to one dog who waited, many others who had been waiting for months, or even years, finally found their homes. But Thor still had one last journey to complete. A final chapter that needed to be closed in the place where he was born, and where his story almost ended before it even began. On a quiet Sunday morning, Daniel opened a drawer and took out a manila envelope, its edges worn and corners bent from years of being handled, but never opened. Inside was a copy of the fire report, something he had avoided for nearly a decade. An address was circled in red. 781 Hillside Road, the site of the cabin that had burned down, the place he once called home, the place where Thor was born, where he was lost, and where they were now returning. They drove in silence for over an hour as the road climbed into the hills, narrowing until it became a gravel path overgrown with weeds. Daniel hadn't been back since the fire. What was once his refuge was now just a scar on the map. Thor was in the back seat, his nose pressed against a cracked window, his tail on high alert, as if he knew what awaited them. When they reached the gate, Daniel got out and walked down the old path. Thor followed slowly, his ears twitching at every sound, his tail low but not tucked in fear. The cabin was gone. In its place was a clearing with a few remnants of the foundation and a chimney that stood crooked, like a broken tooth in the earth. The air smelled of pine, moss, and old ashes. Daniel knelt and touched the ground. I thought you died here, he said softly. Thor didn't respond. He simply settled beside him. Then Thor got up and began to walk. Daniel followed as the dog headed toward the edge of the clearing. He sniffed, paused, and then turned sharply toward a thicket of trees. Hidden in the overgrowth was an old training shed, its roof partially collapsed and the door hanging from a single hinge. Inside, Daniel remembered, were food bins, toys, training cones, and even Thor's very first collar. Slowly, Daniel pushed the door open. A smell of smoke and decay filled the air, But beneath the mess, Thor walked right in. He sniffed his way to a far corner and stopped. Underneath a charred plastic crate was a worn, partially melted red ball. Daniel picked it up gently. Thor wagged his tail once, nudged the ball with his nose and lay down. It was a memory, a sign that the circle was now complete. Daniel sat beside him, placing the ball between them. "You survived all this," he whispered, "and you became more than I ever imagined." Thor leaned against Daniel's leg and let out a deep sigh, the kind of sigh a dog only makes when a part of its soul has finally found peace. The next day, Daniel and Camilla filed the paperwork to officially buy the land. Not to rebuild the cabin, not to make it a home, but to create something greater. They decided to call it Thor's Field, a quiet, safe sanctuary where older dogs and those who had spent too long in shelters could live freely, even if they never found a forever home. Because Thor had shown them that sometimes, the place you're meant to be isn't behind a fence, but in the space between your pain and your recovery. In the weeks that followed, the story spread once again. Volunteers signed up to clear the land. Builders offered to donate fencing, and children wrote letters to Thor thanking him for saving Edwarda, for waiting 6 years, and for showing the world that even the forgotten can become unforgettable. One evening, just before they laid the first stone for Thor's field, Daniel sat on the grass beside the dog. "Are you ready?" he asked, "to let others rest where you were broken?" Thor laid his head on Daniel's lap and closed his eyes, as if to say, yes. There was still one final chapter to be written. A last visit. Not for Thor, but for someone who had never stopped loving him. The first letter arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, just a postmark from Vermont, and a label written in a shaky hand. For whoever has Thor. Inside was a folded piece of paper and an old photo of Thor as a puppy, no more than 6 weeks old, licking peanut butter off a little girl's face. Daniel sat on the porch and read it slowly. His name was Spot. I got him for my 10th birthday, and for 2 years he was my best friend. Then my parents divorced, we lost our house, and I lost him. I've been looking for him ever since. When I saw him on television, I knew it was him. I don't need him back. I just needed to know he's okay. Thank you for giving him the life I never could." Daniel wiped away a tear as he looked at Thor, now lying in the grass, watching birds fly across the sky. "People don't just remember you," he said aloud. "They carry you with them." Soon, more letters arrived. From shelter volunteers, from former staff, and even from a man who confessed he had almost adopted Thor 3 years ago and still blamed himself for walking away. Every letter shared the same message. Thor had changed someone's life forever. Then one day, Camilla showed up at Daniel's house carrying a small box. "What's this?" he asked. She placed the box on the porch table and carefully opened it. Inside was a hardcover book with a photo of Thor on the cover. It was a children's book, self-published, with 30 pages of simple drawings and direct words, but with a powerful message. Sometimes, the dog you walk past is the one who will one day save your life. Daniel slowly turned the pages, then closed the book and hugged her tightly. That weekend, Thor made his final public appearance at the opening ceremony for Thor's Field. Children ran across the lawn. Elderly dogs from the shelter rested in the shade of the trees, and a plaque was unveiled with the inscription, "Thor waited 6 years. Now no dog will wait alone again." Thor settled down beside the sign, calm and serene. Back home that night, Daniel sat on the floor beside him and whispered, "Can I tell you something?" Thor lifted his head, his eyes asking the question. "I thought I was saving you," Daniel said. "But you were saving me too." A few weeks later, Thor passed away peacefully. No pain, no fear, just a soft sigh as he left behind a life where he had given far more than he had ever received. But his story didn't end there. Thor's field flourished. Camilla's book made its way into classrooms across the country. Adoption rates at shelters soared. And every morning Daniel still sat on his porch, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Because Thor had taught the world something beautiful, that you are never too old, too broken, or too forgotten to become someone's hero. If Thor's story has touched your heart, remember that every shelter dog is waiting for their moment, and you could be the one to give them that chance.